It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I had the winning ticket, the jackpot worth millions, tucked inside my drawer. For weeks I dreamed of paying off debts, fixing my father's roof, maybe even retiring early. But when the numbers finally hit, the ticket was gone. I stared at the empty drawer, my chest hollowing out. And when I looked up, my son and daughter were already there, smiling too wide, standing too close. Something inside me snapped. I realized the unthinkable. The betrayal wasn't from strangers. It was from my own blood. That night, as the world celebrated Thanksgiving, I sat at the table with people plotting my erasure. And the worst part, I still didn't know how far they'd already gone. If you've ever wondered what betrayal feels like when it comes from inside your family, stay with me. This story will not end the way you expect. The morning after the ticket disappeared, the house felt too quiet. I woke up before the sun, hoping I'd dreamt the whole thing, that maybe the ticket was still right where I left it. But the drawer was open again. The stack of old papers had been moved slightly, like someone had gone through them during the night. I stood there for a long time, trying to remember, had I opened it myself? I couldn't be sure anymore. I checked the kitchen table, the pockets of my jacket, even the old radio by the window. Nothing. The ticket was gone. I told myself not to panic. Old age plays tricks on you, I thought. Maybe I put it somewhere safe, so safe even I couldn't find it. Still, the more I searched, the heavier the silence felt, pressing down like a question I didn't want to ask. By evening, the family came over for Sunday dinner. David, his wife Lisa, and my granddaughter Emma. I tried to act normal, though my mind kept drifting back to that drawer. We hadn't sat together for weeks. The smell of roast chicken used to mean comfort. Now it just reminded me how far apart we'd become. Lisa placed the plates on the table, her smile polite but hollow. David scrolled through his phone while I poured water into the glasses. Emma was the only one who looked at me. "You okay, Grandpa?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," I lied, just thinking about something I lost. Lisa looked up, smirking. "Maybe you just dreamt about it." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes weren't. David didn't look at me at all. It used to be that every Saturday night we'd sit around the old TV waiting for the lottery numbers together. Back then we'd laugh, tease each other, make promises we never kept. Now no one even noticed when the results played on the radio. When did we stop caring about the small things? I glanced at David. He used to ask for advice, come to the garage when I worked late. Now he barely visited unless it was Sunday, and only because his wife insisted. Lisa was efficient, sharp, and always in control. I could feel her watching everything, calculating even when she smiled. And Emma, 17, bright, too kind for her own good, she was the only one who still hugged me before leaving. I watched them eat, saying nothing, feeling the weight of every quiet second between us. The chair across from me, the one my wife used to sit in, stayed empty as always. Maybe that's why I'd started buying those tickets in the first place, a way to fill that space. A small hope folded into paper. David cleared his throat. "Dad, you should stop wasting money on those numbers. It's not healthy." "I wasn't talking about that," I said, "but thank you for the advice." He frowned, but I could tell he didn't understand what I meant. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Lisa talked about bills. David checked sports scores. I stayed at the table, tracing my finger along the grain of the wood, remembering the night before, the way the curtain had moved when there was no wind. It replayed in my head again and again. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it all, that I'd simply misplaced the ticket. But deep down, something told me I hadn't. There was a shift in the air, a small fracture between trust and suspicion, and once you notice that crack, you can't unsee it. Emma sat beside me later, her voice barely a whisper. "Grandpa, did you lose something important?" I hesitated. "Maybe." "If you find it, what will you do first?" she asked. I smiled at her, though it hurt to do it. "I'd fix the roof," I said, "and maybe fix us too." Her eyes softened. She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she should. That night after they left, I stood by the window watching their car disappear down the road. The house went quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you question your own heartbeat. They thought I was just chasing luck, but I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing something else, proof that this family still meant something. They thought it was just another ticket. They were right, except this one held the truth. The next morning, I decided to search again. The sun hadn't even climbed over the trees yet, and the house was wrapped in that gray half-light where everything looks like a memory. I went through the drawers again, slower this time, touching every corner, every envelope, every folded note. Nothing. I even checked the garage. The smell of oil and old paint hit me like a wave of time. That place used to be mine, the one corner of the world that made sense. On the shelf sat the small wooden box my wife used to keep her sewing needles in. I opened it, hoping maybe by some miracle I'd find the ticket tucked inside. All I found were 3 buttons, a dried rose, and a photo of her smiling the day we bought this house. She looked alive, like she still believed the future was ours to shape. I stood there holding that photo and whispered, "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you?" The silence didn't answer. It never does. When David came by that afternoon, he didn't knock. He walked straight in like it was still his house. "Dad, I checked your bank account," he said. "You've been spending too much lately. We need to talk about responsibility." I looked at him carefully, trying to see if guilt showed anywhere on his face. But there was nothing. Just the same impatience, the same tired look of a man who thought he knew better. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "But I can manage my own money." He sighed. "You can't even manage where you put your keys half the time." He smiled like it was a joke, but it wasn't funny. He left soon after taking half of the afternoon light with him. Later that day, Emma dropped by after school. She carried her sketchbook and a chocolate bar, her usual peace offering. "Grandpa," she said, sitting across from me, "you look tired." "Just thinking," I told her, "about how quickly things disappear when you stop looking." She frowned. Like what I smiled. Like time. Like trust. She didn't press further. She just opened her book and started to draw. When she finished, she turned it around to show me. It was a sketch of my hands wrinkled, holding something invisible. "It's what you're looking for," she said, "even if you can't see it yet." I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I just nodded and looked away, pretending there was dust in my eye. That night, as I sat alone again, I could still hear her voice, soft but steady. And for the first time, I realized how empty the house sounded when no one was laughing. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suspicious. Like the walls themselves were keeping secrets I hadn't learned yet. I didn't know it then, but the real search hadn't even started. I was about to discover that the hardest thing to find isn't what you lost, it's the truth hiding in plain sight. 15 years ago, I caught my son stealing from me for the first time. It was only $20 tips from a long day at the garage. He was maybe 10, standing by the counter with his hands behind his back, pretending to look innocent. I remember the sound of the bills crinkling in his pocket. When I asked where he got them, he froze. Then he lied. So easily. "I found it on the ground," he said. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But when I made him hand it over, his face hardened. That's when I told him, "If you lie about small money, son, someday you'll lose bigger ones." He didn't answer, just stared at me with eyes that were too old for his age, cold, defiant, as if something inside him had already stopped trusting me. I thought it was just a childish mistake. But some mistakes grow up with us. Years later, after his mother passed away, he came to me again, this time not as a boy, but as a man. He said he needed $10,000 for a business idea. He looked desperate, tired, broken in the way only grown men can be. I didn't ask for details, I just wrote the check. Because that's what fathers do, they give even when the giving hurts. A year later, the business was gone. He never mentioned the money again, and I never asked for it back. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to see that same cold look in his eyes again. After my wife died, the house changed. It felt larger somehow, like the walls had moved farther apart. I'd walk from room to room just to hear the echo of my own footsteps. That's when the tickets started. Every Saturday, one ticket, same store, same clerk, same joke about how I was the most faithful loser in town. I'd laugh, pretend it was all in good fun. But truth is, those little pieces of paper felt like company. They were small chances to matter again. I'd sit by the window at night, radio on low, whispering the numbers as they were called, pretending someone else was listening with me. Sometimes I'd imagine her, my wife, standing beside me, smiling that soft smile that could make bad days end quietly. I'd picture her hands resting on mine, saying, "See, you're still trying." That's how I met hope again, not as a promise, but as a habit. Then Emma came along, bright and curious, asking too many questions for a 17-year-old. She was the one who still saw me not as old, not as useless. When she visited, the house felt alive again. "Grandpa," she'd say, leaning over the table, "what would you do if you ever won?" "I'd fix the house," I told her once, "maybe take you to see the ocean." She smiled. "You don't need to win for that." I laughed. You'd be surprised. Life keeps a bill for every dream you ignore. She rolled her eyes the way only teenagers can, but she kept smiling. I think she liked believing that the world still owed good people something. Maybe I liked it too. When she left that night, she turned at the door and said, "If you ever do win, promise you'll spend some on yourself, okay?" I nodded, but I didn't mean it. I wasn't buying tickets for me. I was buying time. Moments of pretending that luck might remember my name. Proof that I still existed, that I still had something worth waiting for. And when that ticket finally matched for the first time in my life, I thought maybe I hadn't been foolish after all. Maybe I'd been patient. But patience, I would soon learn, is only rewarded in stories. In real life, someone always collects your winnings before you do. Sometimes, I wonder what it really means to be lucky. When I was younger, luck used to look like hard work paying off, or a stranger's kindness when I least expected it. Now, it's just numbers printed on a piece of paper, numbers that meant nothing to anyone but me. That night, after matching those numbers, I sat for hours staring at the ticket under the lamp. The glow made the ink shimmer like it was alive. I thought about calling someone, David maybe, or even Lisa, to tell them the good news. But the thought faded as quickly as it came. I could already hear their voices in my head, disbelief, impatience, maybe even laughter. So I did what I always do. I talked to the empty chair across from me, the one my wife used to fill. "I did it," I whispered. I finally caught a bit of luck. For a moment I imagined her smiling, saying she was proud of me. And I let myself believe it just long enough to feel warm again. Winning wasn't about the money. It was about being seen, being heard. About proving that even when the world stops listening, you can still whisper back and make it notice you. That's what that ticket was for me, a conversation with life itself. And for one small night, I thought life had finally answered. The morning light came through the blinds like thin knives, sharp and colorless. I hadn't slept. Every sound felt suspicious. The creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, even the wind brushing against the house. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish, that no one would care about an old man's lottery ticket. But the thought kept crawling back. Someone had been in that room. I started searching again. The table, the drawers, the small tin box where I kept old receipts. I opened every cabinet twice. Nothing. When I lifted the newspaper, a few crumbs scattered across the table. I remembered eating toast there the morning I checked the numbers. The ticket had been right beside my plate. I walked to the kitchen counter and stared at the empty space where it should have been. The light hit the surface just right, and for a second I thought I saw a faint outline of where the ticket once lay. I ran my finger along it like touching a scar. "Looking for something?" Dad David's voice came from behind me, casual, too casual. He stood at the doorway with his coffee mug hair still wet from the shower shirt neatly pressed. "My ticket," I said. "You remember the one I told you about?" He raised an eyebrow. "You still thinking about that? I can't find it." He walked closer, set his mug down, and started opening drawers beside me. "You probably tossed it out by mistake. You know how paper piles up around here." "I didn't throw it away," I said quietly. He gave a soft laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Then maybe it grew legs. I didn't answer. He kept talking while pretending to help me look. His voice filled the silence like static, harmless words that meant nothing. But his eyes kept darting toward the door. When he finally left for work, I stood there listening to the engine of his SUV fade down the street. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the way he'd said, "Maybe it grew," legs kept echoing in my head. By noon, I went through the trash piece by piece. Coffee filters, eggshells, receipts, no ticket. My back ached. My hands smelled of old food and soap. I sat on the floor for a long time just breathing. That evening, Emma called. "Grandpa, you sound tired. I've been looking for something," I told her. "Did you lose another screwdriver?" I almost laughed. "Something smaller, but worth a bit more." She paused. "You'll find it. You always do." I wanted to believe that too. The next day I walked to the corner store with an old ticket I'd kept in my wallet, the one from last week. I told the clerk to check it. He scanned it, smiled politely. "Sorry, sir, not a winner." I nodded. "Could you check again?" He did. Same answer. Maybe I really had confused the tickets. Maybe I'd imagined it all. When I came home, David and Lisa were already there. Lisa was rearranging things in the kitchen like she owned the place. David sat at the table scrolling through his phone. Lisa glanced at me. Where have you been, Dad? The store. Still chasing those numbers? She said, smiling. You're addicted. It's not an addiction, I said. It's a habit. There's a difference. She shrugged. Habits cost money, too. David looked up, then half amused. Dad, we checked the news. There's no unclaimed $500,000 ticket around here. You must have read it wrong. Maybe I said. Maybe not. He leaned back, crossed his arms. You've been forgetting things lately. Misplacing keys, leaving the stove on. Lisa noticed. Lisa nodded as if they'd rehearsed it. We're just worried, that's all. Emma, sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. Grandpa's fine. David shot her a warning look. Stay out of it, Emma. Her voice cracked. He's not crazy. The room went silent. The clock ticked between us like a metronome, keeping time for disappointment. I looked at David. Is that what you think? That I made it up? He hesitated, then said, I think you believe it, but believing something doesn't make it true. I laughed softly. No, but lying doesn't make it false either. Lisa sighed. Let's not do this. I picked up my glass of water, staring into it as if the truth might float to the surface. I wanted to shout to demand they help me search, but something in their faces stopped me. There was no room left for trust in that house, only proof. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying their words. You're forgetting things. You're confused. You're losing your mind. They said it so gently it almost sounded like care. Almost. I got up around midnight and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness like a confession. I went through every drawer again. When I opened the one beside the sink, I noticed faint fingerprints in the dust along the edge. Larger than mine. Fresher. My heart pounded, but my head told me not to be ridiculous. Maybe I'd touched it earlier. Maybe dust just settled that way. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't empty. Every creak of the floor felt deliberate. Every shadow looked shaped by intent. I whispered to myself, You're just tired. But even my voice didn't believe me. By morning, I looked worse than I felt. My reflection in the mirror seemed older, hollow around the eyes. I told myself I'd stop searching, that I'd let it go. Then David arrived unannounced again. You didn't answer your phone, he said. I was sleeping. You should keep it near you. What if there's an emergency? I smiled faintly. If there's an emergency, you'll be the last to know. He frowned. That's not funny. He walked around the house, straightening things that weren't crooked, touching objects that weren't his. You should let me take care of the bills, he said. And maybe the car. You don't drive much anyway. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them, as if control was something he was slowly collecting, one small permission at a time. I wanted to tell him to stop, but I didn't. Instead, I watched his hand brush against the table where the ticket had once been. And I thought if he did take it, he wouldn't admit it now. Thieves never confess until the evidence speaks first. That night, I sat alone at the table again. The same place, same chair, same silence. I wrote the numbers on a scrap of paper, just to see them alive again. 7, 12, 16, 22, 33, 45. My handwriting looked weaker now. Maybe David was right. Maybe I was slipping. Or maybe that's what they wanted me to think. When I closed my eyes, I saw the ticket burning away into ash, leaving only those numbers carved into my memory like a wound that refused to heal. I don't know how long I sat there before I whispered to the empty room, If you're real, show yourself. The house stayed still. But somewhere outside, I heard a car door close. 2 days passed before I heard from David again. He showed up in the afternoon holding a bouquet of lilies, my wife's favorite. He hadn't brought flowers since her funeral. I thought these might brighten the place up, he said. His tone was light, almost rehearsed. He walked through the door like a salesman stepping into familiar territory, pretending the last conversation never happened. I motioned for him to sit. Coffee? He nodded. Sure. The silence between us thickened while the kettle whistled. He cleared his throat. I shouldn't have snapped at you the other day. I was just stressed about work. I handed him the mug. You didn't hurt me, son. I paused. You just reminded me of myself when I used to lie to my father. He froze, cup halfway to his lips. For a second, I saw a flicker of something, guilt maybe. Then it was gone. He smiled thinly. Guess we all pick up bad habits. He left the flowers on the table when he went. They looked nice, I'll admit, but their scent lingered too long. Sweet at first, then heavy, almost rotten. I stared at them for hours that night, wondering which was worse, being lied to or pretending you didn't notice. The following week, Emma came by after school. She needed to borrow her uncle's car to drive supplies for a fundraiser. David tossed her the keys without a second thought. Later that evening, she returned pale and trembling, a folded slip of paper clutched in her hand. Her voice shook. "Grandpa, I found this. I took it from her." The creases were deep, the corners frayed, but the numbers were still there. 7, 12, 16, 22, 33, 45. Unclaimed, unsigned. My chest tightened. "Where did you find it?" I asked. "In the car," she whispered. "Inside the glove box." I sat down slowly. "Whose car?" "Dad's." The room fell silent. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath. I traced the ticket with my thumb, feeling the slight indent where my own handwriting had been, the faint mark of my initials on the edge. Proof fragile, but undeniable. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Grandpa, I don't understand. Why would he?" I put a hand on hers. "Don't say it. But Emma, listen to me." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The truth doesn't need to shout. It just waits. When the time is right, it opens its eyes." She nodded, wiping her face. "Will you tell him?" "Not yet," I said. "Not until I decide whether I want justice or peace." She looked at me the way her grandmother used to, worried and proud at the same time. When she left, I sat in the dark, holding that ticket between my fingers like a confession I wasn't ready to read aloud. I could have stormed into his house. I could have screamed, demanded answers, forced apologies. But something told me anger wasn't what this moment needed. It needed clarity. It needed patience, the same patience that kept me buying those tickets week after week. So I hid it again, not out of fear but out of mercy, because sometimes the only way to make someone see their guilt is to let them live inside it. Days passed. I went about my routines, quietly waiting, watching. David came by once more, cheerful, confident, asking if I needed groceries. He never mentioned the ticket. He never mentioned the flowers. And I never mentioned the truth sitting inside my desk drawer. But I saw it in his eyes now, the restlessness, the way he avoided looking at that drawer whenever he passed by. He knew I knew. He just didn't know how much. One night as I turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, it wasn't my face I saw. It was his. Younger, sharper, hungrier. Maybe that was the worst part, realizing that the thief I'd raised was only following the map I'd drawn for him. Maybe somewhere along the line I'd taught him that winning was more important than being right. I whispered into the darkness, "Forgive me for what I'm about to do." Because forgiveness, I knew now, wasn't the same as forgetting. A week later, David hosted a family dinner at his house, a rare invitation. He cooked steak, poured wine, talked about new job opportunities. I watched him, listen to his laughter fill the room. He looked like a man who'd buried his sins under comfort. When dessert came, Lisa joked, "Maybe one day we'll actually win that lottery Dad keeps talking about." David laughed too quickly. "Yeah, maybe." His eyes flicked toward me for just a heartbeat. I smiled back, calm and deliberate. That's when he knew the game had changed. Later that night as I was leaving, he followed me to the porch. "Dad," he said quietly, "we're good now, right?" I turned to him. "Good, yes. Honest, not yet." He swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, some things can't stay buried forever. Even paper remembers who touched it last." He stared at me, searching my face for how much I knew. I gave him nothing, just silence. He finally nodded, pretending to understand something he didn't. "You should get some rest." "I will," I said. "And you should too. Guilt doesn't sleep well." When I closed the door behind me, I felt strangely calm. There's a power in patience, the quiet kind that doesn't shout or threaten, that simply waits for the truth to walk itself home. That night, I placed the ticket back on my desk. Not hidden this time, not locked away. I left it there, face up, in plain sight. If he came looking again, I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to know I hadn't lost my mind, only my trust. I used to think truth was something you discovered by searching, but now I know it's something you uncover by waiting. They thought I'd forgotten. They thought time would make me small, make me quiet. But I remembered every word, every look, every lie that wore the mask of concern. He thought I was losing my mind, but I was only losing my patience. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the streetlights bleed into the fog. The ticket lay on the desk beside me, glinting faintly under the lamp like an eye that refused to close. It didn't just hold numbers anymore. It held choices. I could call the police. I could tell the world. But what would that make me? A father who turned in his own son, or a fool who stayed quiet out of love? I kept turning the questions over like stones, looking for something clean beneath them. There was nothing. Just the same dirt. The same ache. At dawn, I walked outside. The air smelled of rain, the sky the color of steel. I stood by the fence David had helped me build years ago. We'd worked side by side, hammering boards, arguing about angles and nails, laughing between curses. Back then, he'd looked at me like I was someone worth listening to. I touched the fence now, tracing the cracks where the paint had peeled. Everything we built together was still standing barely, but the color was gone. Later that morning, Emma called. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just thinking. About him." "About us," I replied. "And what comes next?" She hesitated. "Are you going to tell him you know?" I smiled to myself. Not yet. Sometimes silence teaches louder than anger ever could. She didn't speak for a moment. Then softly, "You're not alone, Grandpa." Her words lingered after the call ended. Maybe I wasn't alone. Maybe the truth already had an ally. It just hadn't spoken yet. That evening, I sat back at the table and looked at the lilies David had brought. They were wilting now, the petals curling inward like tired hands. I picked one up, crushed it gently, and watched the dust fall away. Some things lose their beauty faster when they're built on lies. I placed the dried petals beside the ticket like two confessions side by side. Then I whispered, "I'll wait." But not forever, because even patience has an expiration date, and when that day comes, the silence won't be quiet anymore. And if you were me, would you have kept the secret or exposed it all? Tell me what you'd do. Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter. Silence used to mean peace. Now it just means distance. The house has become too quiet again. Even the ticking clock sounds careful, as if it's afraid to remind me how much time has already slipped away. Sometimes I think I can still hear their voices, the laughter, the arguments, the small noises that made a place feel alive. Now, there's only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of my own breathing. I sit at the same table every morning, the same chair staring at the same window. The light lands on the flowers David brought, only a few petals left curling inward like they're hiding from the truth. I haven't thrown them away. I don't know why. Maybe part of me wants to remember how it felt to be offered something beautiful that came from guilt. I've stopped asking why he did it. People always think betrayal begins the moment someone takes from you. It doesn't. It starts the moment they decide you won't notice. Sometimes I imagine my wife sitting across from me, arms crossed, eyes sharp, with that quiet patience she used when I was being stubborn. She'd probably say, "You can fix cars, Henry, but don't waste your life trying to fix people." She was right, of course. I spent years trying to repair things that weren't broken, only people who didn't want to be repaired. David especially. I thought if I gave enough, trusted enough, forgave enough, he'd come around. But you can't build honesty out of guilt. You can only delay the collapse. The truth is, I don't hate him. I hate the part of me that still wants to believe he didn't mean it. Yesterday, I walked to the small church down the street, the same one where we held her funeral. I hadn't been there in months. The doors creaked open and the smell of candles hit me like memory wax dust and something like forgiveness. There was no priest, just the faint light through stained glass painting the floor in pieces of color. I sat in the last pew, my hands folded, though I didn't plan to pray. "Lord," I said quietly, "help me forgive the unforgivable." My voice broke somewhere between the words. Forgive him after everything. After watching him look me in the eye and call me confused. But forgiveness isn't about fairness, it's about freedom. Holding anger too long is like holding your breath. It only hurts you. I stayed there until the light faded and the colors on the floor disappeared. When I finally stood up, I didn't feel lighter, but I felt honest. And sometimes that's enough. Emma came by that evening. She never knocks anymore, just walks in like she belongs here. She brought lemon bread still warm, wrapped in a towel. "You're baking now?" I asked. She smiled. "Therapy, the kind that tastes better than talking." We sat together in the living room, the air filled with the smell of sugar and butter and quiet understanding. After a while, she asked, "Why don't you tell everyone, Grandpa, about the ticket?" I looked at her and said, "Because shouting the truth is easy. Living with it quietly takes strength." She frowned. "But he lied. He stole from you." Yes, I said, and I let him think I didn't know. Do you know why? She shook her head. Because some lessons only grow in silence. Anger makes people deaf, Emma. But guilt has perfect hearing. She didn't say anything. She just leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. After she left, I thought about what she'd said. Maybe I should have exposed him. Maybe I should have made the truth loud. But loud things fade. Quiet things last. And I wanted the truth to last. As the days pass, I realize forgiveness doesn't mean acceptance. It means setting down the weight that doesn't belong to you. I've carried too much for too long, my wife's death. David's failures, the silence between us that grew like mold in the corners of this house. Now I see things differently. The ticket didn't change who I was. It just revealed who they became. I look at it sometimes not with anger anymore, but with curiosity. What if luck had never come? Would David have still stolen something else from me? Trust maybe, or time, or was this always how it was meant to unfold, so I could finally see him clearly? When I was younger, I thought being a father meant protecting your children from pain. Now I think it means teaching them that pain is sometimes the only teacher left. I know people will say I should confront him, demand justice, but justice without understanding is just another kind of theft. I'd rather wait until he can't escape his own reflection. And when that day comes, because I know it will, I won't raise my voice. I'll just say I forgive you and let the silence finish what I started. Sometimes we mistake silence for weakness, but silence can also be the sound of patience sharpening itself. The house feels softer tonight. The clock ticks slower, as if time itself is catching its breath. I pour a cup of tea and sit by the window. The lilies are gone now, their vase empty. I don't mind. Some things need to leave before peace can enter. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's how you make guilt echo louder. The silence is almost over. That's what I told myself when Sunday came again. The house felt too small for all the words I hadn't said. I cleaned the table, wiped the old vase, placed a new candle in the center. I wasn't expecting peace. I was expecting truth. I took the ticket from my desk. It was smooth now, edges flattened from being handled too many times. I slid it into an envelope, sealed it, and placed it beside my plate. For a long while I just looked at it. That small piece of paper had turned my life upside down, yet somehow it had brought me clarity. By evening they all arrived, David, Lisa, and Emma. It had been weeks since we'd all sat together, but they came anyway, maybe out of habit, maybe out of guilt. Dinner smelled of roast chicken and rosemary, the same as always. We ate quietly. No laughter, no conversation, just the sound of knives against plates and the slow rhythm of breath. When the plates were half empty, I said softly, "There was once an old man who thought he'd lost something valuable." Lisa looked up. "A story, Dad?" I nodded. "A short one." I continued. "He searched everywhere, under the floorboards, behind the curtains, even in the pockets of old jackets. He thought his memory had betrayed him. But what he didn't know was that the thief was closer than he ever imagined." The room froze. David set down his fork. The metal scraped against the plate like a confession. Lisa cleared her throat. "Well, did the old man ever find what he lost?" I smiled. He did. But by the time he did, he'd already learned what mattered more. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. The paper made a soft sound as I placed it on the table. David's eyes followed it like a magnet. Emma whispered, "Grandpa." I looked at David, then at Lisa, and said, "You can keep the car, David, but this goes to your mother's charity." David's lips parted, but no words came. His face went pale, like the truth had sucked the air from the room. "Dad," he finally said, "I was going to tell you." I stopped him with a raise of my hand. "You stole my luck, son, but I won't let you steal my peace." He stared at me as if he didn't understand the language I was speaking. Maybe he didn't. Some truths sound foreign when they're said out loud. I didn't mean. "Yes, you did," I said quietly. "That's the part that hurts." Lisa's voice trembled. "Maybe it was a mistake, Henry." I turned to her. "Mistakes are what happen once. Lies are what you rehearse." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the clock tick, 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 like it was counting down to something unseen. Emma reached for my hand under the table. Her palm was warm, small, human. She whispered, "I'm proud of you, Grandpa." I squeezed her hand gently. "Don't be proud. Be honest. It lasts longer." David pushed back his chair. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice cracking. "Nothing," I said. "That's the point." He blinked. "So that's it. You humiliate me and call it peace. I shook my head. No, I remind you, there's a difference. He looked around the table, desperate for someone to defend him. Lisa looked away. Emma wouldn't meet his eyes. He stood there, breathing heavy until he realized there was nothing left to say. Dad, he whispered, I don't know who you are anymore. I smiled sadly. That makes two of us. Then I slid the envelope across the table toward Emma. Take it tomorrow, I said. Cash it in. Donate every penny. Make sure your grandmother's name is written on the check. Emma nodded, tears streaking her face. David turned away, muttering, You're doing this to punish me. No, I said. I'm doing this so I can sleep. The silence that followed was heavy but not cruel. Sometimes the loudest sound in a room is the shame no one admits to. I looked at my son one last time. I didn't raise you to be rich, I said. I raised you to be right. He couldn't look at me. His jaw trembled, his hands fidgeted with the napkin until it tore. And then, without a word, he walked out. When the door closed behind him, the air changed. It didn't feel lighter, just truer. Lisa followed soon after, mumbling something about needing fresh air. Only Emma and I remained. She wiped her cheeks and whispered, You did the right thing. Maybe I said, but right things don't always feel good. She nodded, and for a while we sat there in the quiet, grandfather and granddaughter, two people left in the wreckage of love trying to find what still worked. When she left, I blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward like a ghost leaving the room. I walked to the window and watched the sunset bleeding over the rooftops. Peace doesn't come from winning. It comes from letting go. For the first time in months, I felt something shift inside me, not joy, not relief, just honesty. And maybe honesty was enough. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt honest. The morning after the dinner, the house felt lighter. For the first time in months, peace didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. The sun came in through the kitchen window, soft and gold, touching everything it once ignored. I made myself a cup of coffee, slow and careful, the way I used to when my wife was still here. The cup steamed in my hands, warm against the quiet. I almost smiled. Then 3 knocks at the door. Firm, hesitant, I opened it to find a mail carrier holding a small envelope. No return address, just my name written in David's handwriting. I thanked him, closed the door, and stood there for a long time before opening it. Inside was a short note folded twice. I'm sorry. I already cashed it. The rest is yours. David. A check slipped out behind it, trembling slightly as it fell onto the table. Half the amount, maybe less. I stared at it. No anger, no shock, just a slow ache. He still didn't understand. He thought he was giving me money. But all I ever wanted was the truth. I picked up the check, turned it over in my hand, and whispered, You still don't get it, do you, son? Then I walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held it to the edge of the paper. The flame caught quickly, curling the corners inward. I watched as the numbers disappeared, the ink turning into ash. The fire didn't roar. It just breathed, soft, steady, final. For a long time I stood there watching it burn, listening to the faint crackle of paper turning to dust. And when the last ember died, I said quietly, Voices fade. But guilt echoes louder. I opened the window and the morning air carried the smoke away. Outside, the world kept moving, unbothered, unbroken, and for the first time I didn't feel like a ghost in my own home. I felt alive again. If you were in my place, would you have forgiven him? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life family dramas every week. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you.